Hey guys, my name is Tom, and welcome back to another devlog for my still unnamed pirate game, which is set in the Age of Sail, but with the twist that the Greek myths aren't actually myths. In this one, I want to focus on getting the basics of melee combat in place. So it's been 2 weeks since the last devlog, and during the first week, I sort of ended up taking a break from the project. The second week, I mostly spent reading through the comments on my ranged combat devlog again, and planning out melee combat with many of your suggestions fresh in mind. What I've come up with for now is still relatively basic, but I think it will be a good starting point. For offense, I'm thinking left click to attack, and the duration of your click affects the amount of damage you do. This would add some variation to the otherwise overly simplistic click to attack mechanic, and I'll probably also have the duration of your click affect things like recovery or reload time when you miss, and maybe even the length of the stun if your opponent blocks successfully. Stuns is something I'm going to have to be very careful with because I want melee combat to be the core part of PvP, which means it needs to flow well and feel good. Stuns can either help with that, or they can completely ruin the flow, so when exactly I'll apply them is going to be extremely subject to change and will require lots of testing to get right. I also considered the idea of having the velocity of the weapon itself affect your attack's strength, but I'm not entirely sure if I want to do that. If I do end up including that, it'll be later on, which is why I wrote it down in green. In terms of defense, right-clicking will block, which shouldn't be much of a surprise. I want to focus mostly on offense in this devlog, which is why I marked most of the stuff here on the defense side for later. After successfully blocking, I thought it might be cool to have the ability to initiate some sort of counterattack, which could be faster, deal more damage, or be entirely unblockable. However, I may need to add some sort of timing mechanism to that, so it's at least a little difficult to execute properly. Additionally, I really want to avoid players blocking indefinitely, so I might add a stamina system specifically for blocking. Alternatively, I could set it up so that a block only avoids all damage for the first second or so, after which it would gradually become less effective if you get hit. Since I'd also like to include some sort of sidestep or dodging mechanic, I had the idea that that could potentially double as a way to initiate a thrust when attacking instead of a slash, but that's for the future. I did write down a few things for how I might implement health and regen down the road, but I've already been rambling quite a bit, so I think I'll explain that stuff later in the video. If you're interested in that or you'd like to suggest your own ideas, make sure to stick around. Yesterday I made the necessary changes to my input system so that I can now handle mouse buttons being held down on the server side, which means we should be good to go to start implementing the very basics. My main goals for today are to get the basic click to attack functionality working and to model a sword. Depending on how long that takes, I might start working on blocking as well, but for now I'm going to get to work. It's Thursday evening now, and I've finally got the basic attack working. Implementing the attack mechanic itself actually only took an hour or two, but it took me a while to get around to that as I ended up rewriting a lot of my input system. More precisely, I rewrote the entire equipment side of the input system. Until now, the only gear in the game was the flintlock and the grappling hook, and the code that makes them work wasn't reusable at all. Now with the sword coming into play as well, I figured I should probably take some time and set the equipment logic up in a way that will allow me to add more tools much quicker in the future. Anyways, with that in place, the main challenge with getting the sword working was just getting the math right, and I'm still not sure that I've fully succeeded in that department. In my attack method, I first call physics.overlap sphere to check if any players are within range. Then for each player that was found, I make sure they're not the player that's performing the attack, since you obviously shouldn't be able to hit yourself. Assuming the player we're currently looking at is an enemy, I calculate the closest point on the collider to the player that's attacking, as well as the direction between the attacker and the victim. Then if the victim is within a certain angle of the direction that the attacker is facing, and if there's no objects like trees or walls in the way, damage is dealt. I decided to go with a largely math-based approach for the melee combat because I want to be able to manipulate things like the range of sword attacks based on what feels right, and that would become rather difficult if I take the approach of sticking a collider on the sword, since it wouldn't make sense to have the collider be longer or shorter than the model. I also didn't want to deal with animations on the server, and using math to calculate whether or not you hit your opponent allows me to avoid that. Of course, I may change how this works in the future, although I'd need a really good reason to do so. However, this code apparently only works some of the time. Even if I stand directly next to another player and look straight at them, they aren't damaged every time I click. At first I assumed maybe the server wasn't registering all my clicks since I had made some changes to that code, but I double checked and out of 150 clicks, all of them were handled properly by the server. This means it must be some kind of problem with the attack logic itself. From my limited testing so far, whether or not the player actually takes damage seems to be extremely random and completely unpredictable. I think bugs that are hard to reproduce are easily the most annoying and difficult to solve, so I'm really hoping that won't be the case when I do some proper debugging tomorrow. You've probably noticed that the grappling hook, the pistol, and now the sword all float in the air in front of you, and I just wanted to confirm that it won't be staying that way. I'm just avoiding doing animations right now, particularly because getting gameplay going is more important at this stage. This does mean that for now the sword will probably provide 0 player feedback when you swing, which isn't great, but it'll have to do. On a different note, I made a quick change and removed the white tint from the blur effect on the title screen. Once that was gone, I could set the UI panel to be fully opaque without the background looking really white, and I've got to say, it looks way better than before. Alright, it's Friday evening now, and I've had a pretty productive day, so there's quite a bit I want to talk about. First and foremost, as you just saw, I made a sword model. Considering that this is a pirate game, you may have expected me to model a cutlass, but this is a Xiphos, which was a commonly used ancient Greek sword. Every time I see the word, I want to say Xiphos, but apparently it's actually pronounced Xiphos, so we'll go with that. Anyways, I went with the Xiphos over the cutlass because cutlasses feel very obvious and somewhat generic when it comes to pirates. The Xiphos sounds much more interesting, and in a way it's almost refreshing. Plus it fits the idea that this game is set during the Age of Sail in a world where the Greek myths are real. The way I'm picturing it, if the Greek myths and gods are real, the ancient Greeks may not have fallen to other civilizations, and therefore their influence and probably their weaponry would still be in use during the Age of Sail. I did consider combining the cutlass and the Xiphos somehow, but I figured that might not be the best idea, since then it'd be completely unrecognizable as a weapon. Also, I wouldn't have had any reference images to go by, and I'm not even sure which parts of which weapon I would have used. Maybe I'll add some kind of combination of the two later on. Depending on how I decide to handle gear, it could just be a cosmetic option, or a weapon with entirely different stats. As you may or may not have noticed at the end of that time lapse, my mesh parts selector script was giving me some issues. This script is meant to find connected triangles within a larger mesh and return them in groups, so I have the ability to set the vertex colors at runtime. This allows me to keep objects like the sword as a single mesh using just one material, while adding different colors to different sections. However, with the sword this didn't seem to be working. After at least an hour of trying to figure out if something was going wrong with the way Unity was importing the mesh, I found out that somehow the sword had a UV map which apparently had a bunch of seams. Those seams were causing the vertices to be split in certain spots, which resulted in my code thinking that those areas weren't actually connected. Once I sorted that out, I split the mesh up into the 4 parts I actually wanted, and then I was able to set the colors of those sections individually. However, I didn't stop there. I was looking at the sword and noticed that the blade wasn't reflecting much light. In other words, it wasn't shiny. Since the terrain, the trees, the rocks, and several other things all used the same material as the sword, I couldn't just play around with the smoothness value since that would affect everything. Since vertex colors have an alpha channel which I wasn't using for anything, I decided to try and use that to store the smoothness value per vertex. This actually only took a few minutes to sort out, and it works extremely well. I can use my existing mesh part selector script, and all I need to do is set the alpha value of a section of the mesh to whatever smoothness value I want it to have. The sword blade is now nice and shiny, while the leather looking hilt doesn't reflect too much light. This is really convenient and works exactly how I'd hoped it would, and although it's hard to tell in screenshots, if you're paying attention when you move the sword around, it's definitely noticeable. I honestly don't even know how to explain how happy I am with how this model turned out. It's by far my favorite of all the ones I've made so far, and I feel like I could just stare at this for a solid hour. I also may have gotten a little carried away while playing around with various colors. I was just messing around, so some of the combinations look absolutely wild, but there's a few which look pretty cool too. If I can find a way to store emission colors and some of the other unused vertex data, I should be able to make sections of meshes glow as well, which would be really sweet. Imagine having glow-in-the-dark swords and other gear. Now, remember the hit detection issue that I mentioned yesterday? Well, I managed to solve that too. After some investigating, I found out that the raycast was sometimes slightly too short. Instead of calculating the distance between the closest enemy point and the camera position and passing that as the raycast's max distance, I now just pass in the sword's range, and that works perfectly. I also took a moment to fix an issue with the camera's submersion detection, which has been slightly inaccurate since I increased the water mesh's resolution. Since the submersion detection uses a separate smaller mesh to calculate the height of the water at the camera's position, and I hadn't updated the resolution of that mesh as well, the triangles didn't properly line up anymore. That was a really easy fix, and it's almost not worth mentioning, but it is nice to get it out of the way since I'd sort of ignored it for the last few weeks. Before I end the devlog, I quickly want to explain my ideas for potential health systems because I'd like to know what you guys think. The most simplistic approach would be to just have several types of food which heal you for different amounts, but I find that quite unexciting. Another option would be something like what Minecraft does. You have a saturation level which slowly decreases over time, eating food increases it again, and depending on your saturation, you'll regenerate more quickly. The third option I thought of, and this is the one I'm sort of leaning towards, is somewhat more environment or behavior based. It's sort of a combination of the first two with some extra stuff thrown in. I could have certain foods which heal you instantly, but they might only be edible in certain quantities. That way, even if you've got a lot of them, you're not automatically unkillable. Other foods would boost your saturation level, which then determines your regeneration speed. Running and jumping could slow your regen speed, and maybe if you're already injured, you take more damage from non-player sources like fall damage. That would obviously need to be balanced properly, but I think it might have potential. All of this is still up in the air though, so I'd love to hear what you think. I make sure to read and respond to all the comments, so I can assure you that any ideas and suggestions you leave below will be seen and considered. Anyways, tomorrow I'll just be editing this video, so I'll have to leave it here for now. I know I talked quite a bit about stuff that related more to some of my future plans than actual progress, but I hope it was still interesting. If you did enjoy the video, please take a moment to smash the like button, as it really does help out the channel. I wanted to implement blocking today as well, but ended up running out of time, so that's what I'll be working on next week, probably followed by a proper health system. If you don't want to miss that, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell so you're always informed when I upload a new video. With that said, thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again next time.